Hi everyone, hope you're all doing well. This will be the last video I do with a very similar colour scheme for the Flesh Eater Courts. I do have a big chunk of my army left to paint, but I have different colour schemes that are similar but also very different, kind of sticking to that classic vibe of Flesh Eater Courts. As always, starting off with a Xenophil of bright neutral grey with Pro-Acryl, and just coming in with a tiny dry brush of titanium white. And as I always do with my Flesh Eater Courts, I'll move on to the next step with a reverse Xenophil of Sunset Purple by scale 75. The next stage is to dry brush Pro-Acryl's Faded Green over the whole model. Do be careful when dry brushing over this model, his ankles are quite fragile and I've cracked mine, so I'm going to have to come in later, remove the paint and fix him. Then with the same faded green, we're going to make a 60-40 paint to retarded dilution, and we're just going to layer in over all the areas we've dry brushed. As always when applying the paint, if you get it in any areas you don't want, switch to a clean damp brush and just feather out the edges to get a clean transition. What I also ended up doing with the dry brush stage that I didn't show is I stippled the faded green across the wings. It creates quite a nice texture across the wings. When layering on the faded green, just make sure to keep the recesses of the muscles clear. We want that definition between the sunset purple and the faded green to be as bold as possible. Then we'll come in with the watercolour and just cover all of our areas, the legs, arms. Later on I end up doing the wings, the crimson red. Again, use any brand, just go for a brand that you can repeatedly buy if you do want to try this technique. I was unlucky when I bought mine thinking that I could continue to get that brand nice and easily from just down the road. Then obviously Wilco shut down, so it's also another reason why I'm changing up my colour scheme. And honestly, you guys don't want to watch me put out videos for a whole army painting the exact same colour scheme, realistically, do you? And I'm getting bored as well. I'm going to move to more of some blues and purples for my Crypt Ghoul, and maybe my Crypt Guard as well. I painted up a couple of Crypt Guard and have a video already painted in the same colour scheme, but I think I'm going to change it up. And then next up, we're just coming in with a bit of Pro-Acryl's bold titanium white, and we're just dry brushing the hair on the wings. And while I had a little bit out on the palette, I mixed about 60-40 paint to retarder, and I just dropped some in the eyes because I had a little bit left over, and I figured you don't want to waste paint. Once we've done that dry brush of white, we're just going to come in with, it's about 3, maybe 4 layers of Drakenhof Nightshade. And be sure during the application of your colours, especially ones that are either shade paints, contrasts, or ones that you're putting retarder in, to keep a clean wet brush on hand so that you can feather out the edges instantly to avoid tea staining. At this stage I was a bit bored with the wings, so I decided to get some Arctic Blue by scale 75. I thinned it down with 60-40% ratio of paint to retarder, and I'm just layering in 2 or 3 thin coats over the whole wing. Deciding to do this after doing the Drakenhof Nightshade on the fur means I ended up actually ruining the fur that was on the inside of the wings, so I had to come back later and redo that. If I was going to paint this model again, which I may do in the future because there's some flaws on this one that I'm just not happy with, then I would do the wings before jumping to the stage of the fur. It's quite a nice colour, this Arctic Blue, to be fair. I like it. And now I wanted to try something that I tried on my Vargulf. So we're bringing some sandalwood in. We're going to concentrate the sandalwood to the lower portion of the wings. We're going to feather it out with a wet brush, and then we're going to come in later on. We're going to put a slight thin layer of water over the whole wing once these paints have dried already, and we're just going to stipple in with the application brush, and then change to the clean wet brush and stipple over that again. And as you can see, I'm already stippling in, but because there's a thin layer of water over the wing already, it dries and it's quite translucent without drying, so you can do 3 or 4 applications before it builds up. I then decided to start from the inside of the wing, and I got heavier going to the outside of the wing. So for the leathers, we're coming in with some brown leather by scale 75. It's a nice rich paint, I like it. It takes Nagrax's Earthshade really nicely as well. And as I have done for all of my Flesh Eater courts, I'm going to use Mars Orange by scale 75. Just do 1 or 2 thin applications of this over the body. It's a ratio around 70-30 paint to retarder. So at this point I was kind of stuck for what I wanted to do because I really didn't want to use metals on the model. So I picked out some black leather by scale 75, which I hadn't actually used before, and honestly it's quite a nice paint. It's very purple. It's not really necessarily black, it's basically a very dark purple, but for this instance it's perfect. All I needed out of this colour was for it to be a nice colour that was also contrasting to the bone. So where I've used this black leather is the 2 chains where there's keys and chain on his wrist. It just kind of breaks it up a little bit. And now for one of my favourite stages, using scale 75 as a Roko, we're going to base all of the bone areas. Whether it be the keys, his talons, claws in his feet, his crest, his teeth, anything we want to be bone, we'll base with a Roko. Then once the Oroko's done, we're going to come in with Bold Titanium White by Pro-Acryl. Again, a ratio of 60-40% paint to retarder. We need to make sure that we can thin this paint out and feather out the edges, so I always use retarder. Gives you a nice long working time and it just makes life easier when painting. And what we're doing with this mix is we're just coming in using it on the outer edges of the bone areas, using a clean wet brush to feather the transition line to the recesses. You might need 2 coats of this, usually just 1, but you might need 2. It just depends on the specific white paint you're using and how well it takes to being thinned down. And after this stage, I didn't record it, but we just place a little bit of Caribou Crimson in the mouth and let it pool around the gums of the teeth. And once we have that stage done, we'll get brown leather again by scale 75, and we're just going to cover all of the rock and mud on the base. Before this stage I ended up using Vallejo Metal Colour Steel on the spikes, and just be sure when painting the base to go up the spikes where there's mud placed and catch all of that. And now the base is done, we can just agrag Earthshade everything we need to. So the orange cloth, any of the browns like the belts, the base, etc. and all of the areas of bone. And And once that's basically dry, we can come in with Scale 75's Fleur FX Techno Green. I use this neat to apply to the eye, and then I get a clean wet brush and I just feather out the edges around the eye. It creates a very nice transition very quickly. I then clean my wet brush again and just dab in the centre of the eye to reveal the eye itself and bring that back to a pure white. This creates a nice glow effect. And then once your eye is done, you can come back in a little while later with a 50-50 mix of the Techno Green and water and just glaze around the eyes a little bit, using your clean wet brush to pull the pigment back to the eye, which will create a nice transition. Then some of the finishing touches here, it's just coming in with Mars Orange. I've thinned this down quite heavily this time. It's a 40 to 60% paint to retarder, and we're just doing 2 thin layers over the highest areas. I do also do a little bit of cross hatching and a little bit of stippling here and there, but it's very light and it's hard to see, but that's the point. It's just supposed to be for the tiniest bit of variation of texture. It's not to be something that's a visual statement. And last but not least, we're just coming with Cryoacryl's Bold Titanium White, a 60 to 40% ratio of paint to retarder, and we're just going to do the very lightest edges of all of our bone areas just to bring that white back up. We want to keep the recesses dark with the Oroco and Agrax Earthshade to keep a higher contrast in the model. Thank you for your support.